So, hello and welcome back yet again to another day with Mr. Dickens. Alliteration is so much fun, isn't it? I try to do it all the time. It's like one of those unconscious things. This is looks like decently long chapter, so I probably won't waffle on too much here at the beginning. But I feel like the story's finally picking up, which makes me happy because it was a little bit draggy at first. Also, although we're not warm again, the weather is better than it's been for the last 2 days, which is probably also making me feel a little better. The last couple days have they've just been rough. So sorry if I've seemed a little bit pessimistic pessimistic. I can speak. I really can. The last couple days, it's just been mostly the weather just dragging me down. There's something about this time of year that makes me desperately ready for spring, and the weather outside is not ready for spring. The weather outside keeps reminding me that, at least in Michigan where I live, March is still winter. April is still technically kind of winter, but as long as I get a few days where it's not windy, really cold, and snowing, I should be okay. We aren't sunny, but we aren't full of snow and wind, so that is good. But we were in court in the last chapter, and Jerry seems to be there just as a messenger in case Mr. Lorry needs him. And we finally met Mr. Charles Darnay, who is on trial for treason. So that is where we're going to pick it up in Book 2, The Golden Thread of A Tale of Two Cities, with Chapter 3, titled A Disappointment. Mr. Attorney General had to inform the jury that the prisoner before them, though young in years, was old in the treasonable practices which claimed the forfeit of his life. That this correspondence with the public enemy was not a correspondence of today or of yesterday or even of last year or of the year before. That it was certain that the prisoner had, for longer than that, been in the habit of passing and repassing between France and England on secret business of which he could give no honest account. That if it were in the nature of traitorous ways to thrive, which happily it never was, the real wickedness and guilt of his business might have remained undiscovered. That Providence, however, had put it into the heart of a person who was beyond fear and beyond reproach to ferret out the nature of this prisoner's schemes, and then, struck with horror, disclose them to his Majesty's Chief Secretary of State and the most honorable Privy Council. That this patriot would be produced before them, that his position and attitude were on the whole sublime, that he had been the prisoner's friend, but at once in an auspicious and an evil hour had detected his infamy and had resolved to immolate the traitor he could no longer cherish to his bosom upon the sacred altar of his country. That if statues were decreed in Britain, as in ancient Greece and Rome, to public benefactors, this shining citizen would assuredly have had one. That, as they were not so decreed, he probably just would not. And that virtue, as had been observed by the poets in many passages, which he well knew the jury would have word for word upon the tips of their tongues, whereat the jury's countenances displayed guilty because they knew nothing about poetry, but was in a matter contagious, more especially the bright virtue known as patriotism. This witness had the love of country, that the lofty example of this immaculate and unimpeachable witness for the crown, to refer to however unworthy was an honor, had communicated itself to the prisoner's servant, and had endangered him in holy determination to examine his master's table drawers and pockets, and secrete his papers. Further, that he, Mr. Attorney General, was prepared to hear some disparagement attempted of this admirable servant, but in a general way, he preferred him to Mr. Attorney General's brothers and sisters, and honored him more than Mr. Attorney General's father and mother. That he called with confidence upon the jury to come and also admire this servant. That the evidence of these two witnesses, coupled with the documents of their discovering that would be produced, would show the prisoner to have been furnished with the list of His Majesty's forces, and of their disposition and preparation both by sea and land, and it would leave no doubt that this prisoner habitually conveyed this information to a hostile power. That these lists could not be proved to be in the prisoner's handwriting was all the same, and indeed it was rather the better for the prosecution, as showing the prisoner to be artful in his precautions. That this proof would go back 5 years, and would show the prisoner already engaged in these pernicious missions within a few weeks before the date of the very first action that had been fought between the British and American troops. That for these reasons, the jury, being a loyal jury, as the prosecutor knew they were, and being a responsible jury, as the jury knew they were, must positively find this prisoner guilty, and make an end of him whether they liked it or not. That the jury could never lay their heads upon their pillows, that they could never tolerate the idea of their wives laying their heads on their pillows, that they could never endure the notion of their children laying their heads upon their pillows. In short, that if they do not find him guilty, there never more could be, for them or theirs, any laying of heads upon pillows at all, unless, of course, the prisoner's head was removed. That head, Mr. Attorney General concluded by demanding of them, in the name of everything that he could think of with a round turn in it, and upon the faith of his solemn assertion that he already considered the prisoner as good as dead and gone. When the Attorney General ceased, a buzz arose in the court as if a cloud of great blue flies were swarming the prisoner, in anticipation of what he was soon to become. When this toned down again, the unimpeachable patriot appeared in the witness box. Mr. Solicitor General, then, following his leader's lead, examined this patriot, John Barsgaard. The story of his pure soul was exactly what Mr. Attorney General had described it to be. Perhaps, if he had a fault, a bit too exactly. Having released his noble bosom of its burden, he would modestly have withdrawn himself, but that wigged gentleman with the papers before him, sitting not far away from Mr. Lorry, begged to ask him a few questions. The wigged gentleman sitting opposite was still looking at the ceiling of the court. The questions were, had he ever been a spy himself? No, he scorned that base insinuation. Well then, what did he live upon? Answer, his property. Where was his property? He didn't precisely remember where it was. What was his property? That was no business of anyone's. Had he inherited this property? Yes, he had. From whom? Distant relation. Very distant? Then he was asked, had he ever been in prison? Certainly not. Not even a debtor's prison? Come, once again. Never. Yes. How many times have he been in debtor's prison? 2 or 3. Not 5 or 6? Maybe. What was his profession? Gentleman. Have you ever been kicked? Maybe. Kicked frequently? No. Have you ever been kicked downstairs? Oh, decidedly not. Once received a kick on top of a staircase and fell down the stairs on his own accord. Were you kicked upon that occasion for cheating at dice? Something to that effect was said by the intoxicating liar who committed the assault, but of course that was not true. Do you swear it was not true? Oh, positively. Have you ever lived by cheating at play? Never. Have you ever lived by play? Not any more than any other gentleman does. Have you ever borrowed money from the prisoner? Yes. Did you pay him back? No. Was not the intimacy with the prisoner in reality a very slight one, forced upon the prisoner in coaches, inns, and packets? No. Surely you saw the prisoner with these lists? Of course, the witness answered. But you knew no more about the lists? No. You had not procured them himself, for instance? No. Then Mr. Solicitor asked, did he expect to get anything by this evidence? No. Not in regular government pay and employment to lay traps? Oh, dear me, no. Or do anything? No. Do you swear? I swear over and over. So you have no motives but sheer patriotism? No other motives, none whatsoever. The virtuous servant, Roger Cly, swore his way through the case at a quick rate. He said he had taken service with the prisoner in good faith and simplicity 4 years ago. He had asked the prisoner, aboard the Calais packet, if he wanted a handy fellow, and the prisoner had engaged him for work. He had not asked the prisoner to take the handy fellow as an act of charity. No, he never thought of such a thing. He began to have suspicion of the prisoner, and then to keep an eye upon him soon after. When he had arranged his clothes while traveling, he had seen similar lists to these in the prisoner's pockets over and over again, and he had taken the list from the drawer of one of the prisoner's desks. He had not put these papers there first. Of course not. He had seen the prisoner show these identical lists to French gentlemen at Calais, and similar lists to French gentlemen both at Calais and Boulogne. He loved his country, this servant, and he couldn't bear it, so he gave information. He had never been suspected of stealing a silver teapot. He had been maligned respecting a mustard pot, but it turned out to be only plate anyway. He had known the first witness 7 or 8 years. That was just a coincidence. He didn't call it a particularly curious coincidence. Most coincidences were curious. Neither did he call it a curious coincidence that the true patriotism was his only motive as well. He said that he was a true Briton, and he hoped that there were many more like him. The bluebottle flies that were the audience buzzed again, and then Mr. Attorney General called Mr. Jarvis Lorry. Mr. Jarvis Lorry, are you a clerk in Tellson's Bank? I am. On a certain Friday night in November 1775, did business occasion you to travel between London and Dover by the mail? It did. Were there any other passengers in the mail? 2. Did they alight on the road in the course of the night? They did. Mr. Lorry, look upon the prisoner. Was he one of those 2 passengers? I cannot undertake to say that he was. Does he resemble either of those 2 passengers? Both of them were so wrapped up, and the night was so dark, and we all so reserved, I cannot say even that. Mr. Lorry, look again upon the prisoner. Supposing him wrapped up as those passengers were, is there anything in his bulk and stature to render it unlikely that he was one of them? No. You will not swear, Mr. Lorry, that he was not one of them? No. So, at least you say he may be one of them. Yes, except that I remember them to both have been, like myself, timid of highwaymen, and the prisoner does not have a timid air. Did you ever see counterfeit timidity, Mr. Lorry? I certainly have. Mr. Lorry, look once more upon the prisoner. Have you seen him ever, to your knowledge, before? I have. And when was that? I was returning from France a few days afterwards, and at Calais, the prisoner came on board the packet ship in which I returned and made the voyage with me. And at what hour did this man come on board? A little after midnight. In the dead of night. Was he the only passenger who came on board at that untimely hour? He happened to be the only one. Never mind about happening, Mr. Lorry. He was the only passenger who came on board in the dead of night. He was. And were you traveling alone, Mr. Lorry, or with a companion? With 2 companions, a gentleman and a lady. They are here. They are here. Had you any conversation with the prisoner? Hardly any. The weather was stormy and the passage long and rough, and I lay on a sofa almost from shore to shore. Miss Manette! The young lady, to whom all eyes had been turned before and were now turned to again, stood where she had been sitting. Her father rose with her and kept her hand through his arm. Miss Manette, look upon the prisoner. To be so confronted with such pity and such earnest youth and beauty was far more trying to the accused prisoner than to be confronted with the entire crowd, standing, as it were, apart with her on the edge of his grave. Not all the staring curiosity that looked on could for the moment nerve him to remain still. His hurried right hand parceled out the herbs in front of him into imaginary beds of flowers in a garden, and his efforts to control and steady his breathing shook the lips from which the color had rushed to his heart. He could hear the buzz of the flies of the audience yet again. Miss Manette, have you seen this prisoner before?
Yes, sir.
Where?
On board of the packet ship just now referred to, sir, and upon that occasion.
You are the young lady who was referred to.
Oh, most unhappily I am.
The plaintive tone of her compassion merged into the less musical voice of the judge as he said fiercely, "Answer the questions put to you, and make no remarks upon them." Miss Manette, had you any conversation with the prisoner on that passage across the channel?
Yes, sir.
Please recall it. In the midst of profound stillness, she faintly began.
When the gentleman came on board.
Do you mean the prisoner? Said the judge, knitting his brow.
Yes, my lord.
Then say prisoner.
When the prisoner came on board, he noticed that my father—
She turned her eyes lovingly to her father as he stood beside her.
—was much fatigued and in a very weak state of health. My father was so reduced that I was afraid to take him out of the air, and I had made a bed for him on the deck near the cabin steps, and I sat on the deck by his side to take care of him. There were no other passengers that night but we four. The prisoner was so good as to beg permission to advise me how I could shelter my father from the wind and the weather better than I had already done. I had not known how to do it well, not understanding how the wind would set once we were out of the harbor, and he did it for me. He expressed great gentleness and kindness for my father's state, and I'm quite sure that he felt it. That was the manner of our beginning to speak together.
Let me interrupt you for a moment. Had the prisoner come on board alone?
No.
How many were with him?
2 French gentlemen.
Had they conferred together?
They had conferred together until the last moment, when it was necessary for the French gentlemen to be landed in their boat.
And were any papers handed about among them, similar to these lists?
Some papers were handed amongst them, but I don't know what papers.
Were they like these, in shape and size?
Possibly, but indeed I don't know, although they stood whispering very near to me, because they stood at the top of the cabin steps to have the light of the lamp hanging there. It was a dull lamp, and they spoke in low voices, and I did not hear what they said. I could only see they looked at papers.
Very well. Now to the prisoner's conversation, Miss Manette.
The prisoner was open in his confidence with me, which arose from my helpless situation, as he was kind and good and quite useful to my father. I hope, she burst into tears, I hope I may not repay him by doing him harm today.
There was more buzzing from the audience. Miss Manette, if the prisoner does not perfectly understand that you give the evidence that is your duty to give, which you must give, and which you cannot escape from giving with great unwillingness, he is the only one in that delusion. Please go on.
He told me that he was traveling on business of a delicate, difficult nature that might get people into trouble, that he was therefore traveling under an assumed name. He said that this business had, within a few days, taken him to France, and might at intervals take him back and forth between France and England for quite some time to come.
And did he say anything about America, Miss Manette? Be very particular.
He tried to explain to me how that quarrel had arisen, and he said that, so far as he could judge, it was wrong and foolish on England's part. He then added in a jesting way that perhaps George Washington might gain almost as great a name in history as King George III. But there was no harm in his way of saying this. It was said laughingly and to beguile the time.
Any strong marked expression on the face on the part of the chief actor in a scene of great interest to whom many eyes are directed will be unconsciously imitated by spectators. Miss Manette's forehead was painfully anxious and intent as she gave this evidence, and in the pauses when she stopped for the judge to write down things, she watched its effect upon the council, both for and against. Among the onlookers, there was the same expression in all quarters of the court, insomuch as that a great many of the foreheads there might have been mirrors reflecting the witness, when the judge looked up from his notes to glare at that tremendous heresy about George Washington. Mr. Attorney General now signified to my lord that he deemed it necessary, as a matter of precaution and form, to call the young lady's father, Dr. Manette, who was then accordingly called. Dr. Manette, look upon the prisoner. Have you ever seen him before?
Once,
When he called at my lodgings in London, some three and a half years ago. Can you identify him as your fellow passenger on board the packet, or say anything about his conversation with your daughter?
Sir, I can do neither.
And is there any special reason for your being unable to do either? He then said in a low voice,
There is.
And has it been your misfortune to undergo a long imprisonment without trial or even accusation back in your native country, Dr. Manette? He answered, in a tone that struck to everyone's heart,
A long imprisonment.
And were you newly released upon this occasion in question?
That's what they tell me.
Have you no remembrance of this?
None.
My mind is a blank from some time, I cannot even say what time, when I employed myself in my captivity in making shoes, to the time when I found myself living in London with my dear daughter. She had become familiar to me when gracious God restored my mind, but I am quite unable even to say how she became familiar. I have no memory of the process. Mr. Attorney General then sat down, and father and daughter sat down together. A singular circumstance then arose in the case. The object in hand being to show that the prisoner went down with some fellow plotter untracked in the Dover mail on that Friday night in November 5 years ago, and had got out of the mail in the night as a blind at a place where he did not remain, but from which he traveled back some dozen miles or more to a garrison and dockyard, and there collected information. A witness was called to identify him as having been at the precise time required in the coffee room of a hotel in the garrison and dockyard town, waiting for some other person. The prisoner's counsel was cross-examining this witness with no result except that he had never seen the prisoner on any other occasion, when the wigged gentleman, who had all of this time been staring at the ceiling of the court, wrote a few words on a piece of paper, screwed it up, and tossed it to him. Opening this piece of paper, in the next pause, counsel looked with great attention and curiosity over at the prisoner. You say again you are quite sure that it was the prisoner? He said. The witness was quite sure. "Did you ever see anybody that was very like the prisoner?" "Not so," said the witness, "as that he could be mistaken." "Look well upon this gentleman, my learned friend," he said, pointing to him who had tossed him the paper, "and then look well upon the prisoner. What do you say? Are they very like each other?" Allowing for my learned friend's appearance being careless and slovenly, if not debauched, they were sufficiently like each other to surprise not only the witness but everyone present when they were thus brought into comparison. My lord, being prayed to bid my learned friend to lay aside his wig, and giving no very gracious consent, then the likeness became even more remarkable. My lord inquired of Mr. Stryver, who was the prisoner's counsel, whether they were next to try Mr. Carton, who was the name of my learned friend, for treason, but Mr. Stryver replied to the judge, no, but that he would ask the witness to tell him whether it happened once, and it might happen twice, whether he would have been so confident if he had seen this illustration of his rashness sooner, whether he would be so confident having seen it, and even more. The upshot of all this was to smash this witness like a crockery and shiver his part of the case into useless lumber. Now, Mr. Cruncher had by this time taken quite a lunch of rust off of his fingers, and in his following of the evidence, he had now to attend while Mr. Stryver fitted the prisoner's case on the jury, quite like a compact suit of clothes, showing them how the patriot, Bassard, was a hired spy and traitor, an unblushing trafficker in blood, and one of the greatest scoundrels upon the earth since Judas, which he certainly did look quite a bit like, and how the virtuous servant, Cly, was actually his friend and partner, and was worthy to be how the watchful eyes of those forgers and false swearers had rested upon the prisoner as to be their victim. Because of some family affairs in France, he, being of French extraction, did actually have to make passages quite often across the Channel. Though what those affairs actually were, a consideration for others who were near and dear to him, forbade him, even for his very life, to disclose to this court. How the evidence that had been warped and wrestled from the young lady, whose anguish in giving this evidence all had witnessed, had come to nothing, involving the mere little innocent gallantry and politeness quite likely to pass between any young gentleman and young lady thrown together. Of course, with the exception of that reference to George Washington, which was altogether too extravagant and impossible to be regarded in any other light than a joke. How it would be a weakness in the government to break down this attempt to practice for popularity on the lowest national fear, and therefore Mr. Attorney General had definitely made the most of it. How nonetheless it rested upon nothing save that vile and infamous character of evidence which often disfigured these cases, and of which the state trials of this country were quite full. But there, my lord imposed, with as grave of a face as if it had not been true, saying that he could not sit upon this bench and suffer this mistrial. Then Mr. Stryver called his few witnesses, and Mr. Cruncher had next to attend while Mr. Attorney General turned the whole suit of clothes that Mr. Stryver had fitted on the jury inside out, showing how Bassard and Cly were 100 times better than he had thought them at the first time, and the prisoner was 100 times worse. Lastly came my lord himself, turning the suit of clothes, now inside out, back outside in, but on the whole, decidedly trimming and shaping them into grave clothes for the prisoner. So now, the jury turned to consider, and the flies that were the audience swarmed again. We have a picture of the trial. Mr. Carleton, who had so long sat looking at the ceiling of the court, changed neither his place or attitude, even during this excitement. While his learned friend, Mr. Stryver, massing the papers before him, whispered with those sitting near, and from time to time glanced at the jury, while all the spectators moved more or less and grouped themselves anew, and while even my lord himself arose from his seat and slowly paced up and down his platform, not unattended by a suspicion in the minds of the audience that his state seemed fevered, this yet one man sat leaning back, with his torn gown half off of him, his untidy wig put back on just as it happened to light on his head after he had removed it, hands in pockets and eyes on the ceiling, as they had been all day. Something especially reckless in his demeanor not only gave him a disreputable look, but so diminished the resemblance that he bore to the prisoner, which his momentary earnestness, when they were compared together, had only strengthened, that many of the lookers-on, looking at him now, said to one another that they hardly would have thought that the two had been so alike. Mr. Cruncher made that observation to his next neighbor, and added, "I'd hold half a guinea that he don't get no law work to do. Don't look like the sort to get any, does he?" Yet this Mr. Carleton took in more of the details of the scene than he appeared to. For now, when Miss Manette's head dropped upon her father's chest, he was the first to see it and say, "Officer, look to that young lady. Help the gentleman take her out. Don't you see she will fall?" There was much commiseration for her as she was removed, and much sympathy with her father. It had evidently been a great distress upon him to have the days of his imprisonment recalled. He had shown strong internal agitation when questioned, and that pondering or brooding look which made him old had been upon him like a heavy cloud ever since. As he passed out, the jury, who had turned back and paused a moment, spoke through their foreman. They were not agreed, and they wished to retire. My lord, perhaps thinking of George Washington, showed some surprise that they were not in agreement, but he signified his pleasure that they should retire under watch and ward, and he retired himself. The trial had gone on all day, and the lamps in the court were now being lit. It began to be rumored that the jury would be out for quite a while. The spectators dropped off to get refreshments, and the prisoner withdrew to the back of the dock to sit. Mr. Lorry, who had gone out when the young lady and her father were out, now reappeared and beckoned to Jerry, who, in the slackened interest, could now easily get to him. "Jerry, if you wish to take something to eat, you can. But keep in the way. You will be sure to hear when the jury come in. Don't be a moment behind them, for I want you to take the verdict back to the bank. You're the quickest messenger I know, and will get to Temple Bar long before I can." Jerry had just enough forehead for him to knuckle, and he knuckled it in acknowledgment of this communication, along with a shilling that he got from Mr. Lorry. Mr. Carton came up right at that moment and touched Mr. Lorry's arm. "How's the young lady?" "She is greatly distressed, but her father is comforting her," said Mr. Lorry, "and she feels better being out of the court." "I'll tell the prisoner that. It won't do for a respectable bank gentleman like you to be seen speaking with him publicly, you know." Mr. Lorry turned red, as if he were conscious of having debated that point in his mind, and Mr. Carleton made his way to the outside of the bar. The way of the court lay in that direction, and Jerry followed him, eyes, ears, and spikes. "Mr. Darnay?" The prisoner came forward immediately. "You will naturally be anxious to hear of the witness, Miss Manette. She will be doing very well. You have seen the worst of her agitation." "I am deeply sorry," said the prisoner, "to have been the cause of it. Could you tell her that for me, with my fervent acknowledgment?" "I could. I will if you ask." Mr. Carleton's manner was so careless as to be almost insolent. He stood, half turned from the prisoner, lounging with his elbow on the bar. "I do ask. Accept my thanks, please." "What?" said Carleton, still only half turned towards him. "What do you expect, Mr. Darnay?" "The worst." "It's the wisest thing to expect, and quite likely. But I think their withdrawing is actually in your favor." Loitering, on the way out of court not being allowed, Jerry heard no more, but he left them, both so like each other in feature and so unlike each other in manner, standing side by side, both reflected in the glass above. An hour and a half limped heavily away in the thief and rascal crowded passages below, even though assisted off with mutton pies and ale. The horse messenger, uncomfortably seated on a form after taking reflection, had dropped into a doze when a loud murmur and the rapid tide of people sitting up and running up the steps that led to court carried him along with them. "Jerry! Jerry!" called Mr. Lorry by the door. "Here, sir. It was a fight to get back again. Here I am, sir." Mr. Lorry handed Jerry a paper through the crowd. "Here, quick, have you got it?" "Yes, sir." Hastily written upon that paper was one word: acquitted. "If you had sent the message recalled to life again," said Jerry as he turned away, "I should have known what you meant this time." He had no opportunity of saying, or so much of thinking anything else until he had cleared the Old Bailey, for the crowd came pouring out with a vehemence that almost knocked him off his feet, and a loud buzz swept into the street, as if the baffled blue flies of the audience were all dispersing to search for other carrion. And that is the end of chapter 3, which I told you was quite the long one. Okay, so our little courtroom drama ended with Mr. Charles Darnay being acquitted of treason because he looked like one of the lawyers. Interesting. I mean, do I think he's innocent? Of course I do, because he's being set up to be the hero. So that was pretty good, though. I did enjoy it. A few times it was kind of hard to tell which character was speaking and keep that straight in my mind, but I think I'm enjoying this a little bit more. Still not quite sure how all of these threads that are supposedly golden are going to tie together, but at least we're getting a lot more of a story, and that makes me happy, and I hope it makes you happy too. Thank you so much for listening. Please do hit the thumbs up on your way out. It does always make me smile. I don't know if it does anything for YouTube, but it makes me happy, and I will see you tomorrow.